right, so after Pontiac's Rebellion, looking at just kind of, again, the aftermath of the French Indian War, debt was the biggest problem, the most glaring problem. George Grenville comes in, he's the new chief minister of imperial finances, and faced with the problem of how do you even deal with imperial finances, meaning England's debt, England's money. His actions, his reasoning said for taxing the colonists was the average Briton paid 26 times the average annual taxes that colonists paid. It was necessary to have British soldiers to defend the western frontier now that it has expanded so far. The colonists should share some of that cost since it's defending them personally. So too many Americans were defying British trade regulations with smuggling, tightened enforcement with navigation acts, and so a lot of it just trying to catch the smugglers, trying to catch those who were trying to bypass these taxes that he saw were so necessary. During this time, between this time and before, it was known as salutary neglect, where basically the colonists got to be ignored. They weren't really strictly enforcing any of those rules that the colonists had argued over since the idea of navigation acts and mercantilism. They really hadn't enforced it, so it hadn't been that big of a deal. The Molasses Act was one of the navigation acts that had been a tax already, but would have destroyed the New England rum making business, so it really hadn't been enforced, and so it's going to be basically kind of replaced. They cut molasses tax in half. It would not have made money otherwise, and to make up for lost revenue, they were going to tax other textiles like wine, coffee, indigo, sugar to help pay for the colonists' defense. This is the first time Parliament had adopted taxes designed to raise revenue, not just regulate trade. So the Sugar Act, or the American Revenue Act of 1764, was the first one with the goal of raising money. Critics had said that the British subjects could only be taxed with their consent, and since there was no colonial representations in Parliament, Parliament had no right to tax them. And the British response was going to be they were virtually represented. Currency Act. The colonists had suffered from a shortage of hard currency known as specie, gold or silver, which meant it was hard to pay off their debt, so they had paper money, tried using tobacco as currency even, basically something like a barter system, something of equal value. But a lot of creditors don't being paid with paper money or tobacco because it fluctuates in value based on market prices, and just did not see that as something that was constant and reliable. For the Stamp Act, this is the one that had the most significance in terms of reaction. Stamp Act, the Sugar Act covered the cost of the soldiers, but they still wanted to make more money. And so they passed this in 1765, requiring a stamp to be on every kind of printed matter. Legal documents, college diplomas, leases, deeds, marriage licenses, even playing cards. And it represented the first act to affect all the colonists and the first effort by Parliament to place a tax on American goods and services rather than an external tax on imports. It was an internal tax, and this was something new. Quartering Act was another one that was passed at this time, requiring colonists to feed and house British troops. And there's a lot of issue with why were the British troops even there, and why are they being requested to need to provide something like this without their consent. So as we look at 1763, before 1763, colonists had taken certain principles and practices for granted: self-government, religious freedom, economic opportunity, territorial expansion, and others in much tighter control after 1763, after the French Indian War ends. Grenville's program they saw as tyranny. Colonists began to identify with the Whig Party, arguing that no Englishman should be taxed without consent of representative government. And a lot of anxiety raising among those who did not agree with the British, their troops, the trials, the taxes. And so they saw their assemblies were supposed to be like Parliament. They're supposed to have a voice, and wanted to continue that voice. Protests in the colonies united them. It was a socializing experience. The French Indian War, they had very bitter feelings towards the British and the control that they felt after the French Indian War. And so the colonists responded with pamphlets, speeches, resolutions, and no taxation without representation. A lot of the protesters were called Sons of Liberty, led by Samuel Adams, arranged meetings, parades, bonfires. A lot of times they would tar and feather the tax officials. Boston mob would often attack the home of a governor or a tax collector. Boycotting was another really popular way to fight against this representation issue. Boycotts were also the main involvement for women. In the Virginia House of Burgesses, inspired by Patrick Henry and talking, they passed the Virginia Resolutions and said that they were entitled to all rights of Englishmen and they could not be taxed without their consent. At the Stamp Act Congress, the Massachusetts House of Representatives, 1765, they invited the other colonists to send delegates, talk about the Stamp Act, respond on what they thought, and so they ended up forming the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, again saying that Parliament had no right to tax them without their representation. The response of this is they do repeal the Stamp Act, but at the same time they're going to pass the Declaratory Act. The Stamp Act goes away. It would have just they would have ended up bankrupting the business because of all the boycotts and the protests. But the Stamp Act, as it goes away and there's lots of rejoicing, Declaratory Act was issued and basically said Parliament's power to make laws concerning the colonists in all cases was going to stay intact. Basically saying Parliament is sovereign over America in all cases, and essentially it was kind of a face-saving attempt. There was a lot of controversy. There was a wedge between England and the colonies. It's going to be hard to come back from. So kind of in the second phase, now that they've really gotten into this taxing and protesting and going forward with this, the Townshend Acts, again, needing revenue. They are going to have, they have the Quartering Act, the response to the Quartering Act by the colonists, a lot of protest to it, and so they're going to pass the Townshend Acts, also called the Revenue Act of 1767, and it's going to tax the imports on glass, lead, paint, paper, tea. Revenues were used to pay colonial governors and officers, to take away the Assembly's financial powers, make them independent from the colonists, so that the colonists no longer pay their salaries. Removes them a little bit from that connection. Colonists responded with boycotts on British goods. The Daughters of Liberty are going to take on that challenge, that goal of boycotting goods. Because when you boycott goods, nobody's buying them, so they're going to lose money. So hopefully trying to coerce them on going back on their original decision and taxes and lower them and meet their demands. Samuel Adams and the Sons of Liberty led a lot of the more aggressive protests. They organized Sons of Liberty in protest to the Boston Town Meeting and Assembly. They passed around the Adams-Otis letter, John Adams and James Otis from the Massachusetts House of Representatives, talking about resisting those Townshend Acts that they had passed. British response said to ask them to withdraw this letter. They refused. The Assembly, they said, was dissolved. But they passed 92-17. The Assembly of Massachusetts said 92-17 that they were not going to rescind that letter. For a while, 92 becomes a patriotic symbol. So they dispatched more British troops to Massachusetts, and then Parliament and Lord North, who's a new chief minister, one of the king's supporters, are going to find a way to try to stop the rebellion. More troops are called in from the frontier into Boston. Tensions were pretty high. People are resenting the troops. The massacre that happens at Boston, March 5th, 1770, some of the colonists were taunting the British soldiers, and they fire into the crowd. 5 people end up being killed, 8 wounded. There's a lot of propaganda to play up the incident, labeled a massacre. Paul Revere makes an engraving. I'm going to skip ahead. I'll show you. This is his engraving, and it was really popular to pass around so people had an image to associate with the stories that were going around, to keep the revolutionary spirit going as people were being inspired, kind of like a rally cry, like a Remember the Alamo, but talking about the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks was one of the ones. He is going to be killed at the Boston Massacre. He'd been a slave, then a freedman, and then will be remembered as a martyr towards the liberty cause. Motivations that are going to push more towards war. The Gaspee incident. Gaspee was a warship, was really good at catching smugglers, ran aground in Rhode Island. They take what they want and attack and burn the ship. There's committees of correspondence that are formed. First one is in Boston, led by Samuel Adams, talking about rights and grievances. They circulate those writings to the other towns, and it basically becomes an early form of networking and communication. The Boston Tea Party, the Tea Act of 1773 was passed, trying to give the East India Company an opportunity to sell a bunch of their excess tea that they had. With again, protesting, boycotting was a big part of it, but they're going to want to do even more, and they're going to have the Sons of Liberty dress up along with others, and they go disguised as Indians, and they throw 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. The effects of this is that the King and Lord North basically said they're going to have to either submit or win, because we're not going to be able to find a way of compromise. So here's the Gaspee. Tar and feathering was a really common way. It's more for humiliation than torture. And then one other thing with the Boston, I'll go back. One other thing I forgot to talk about these last 2 points. After the Boston Tea Party happens, in response to it, the British are going to pass the coercive acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, where they closed the port of Boston until the colonists had paid for the lost tea. They had a new quartering act, essentially get rid of a lot of the democratic institutions in Massachusetts, trying to just, corral and keep Boston and punish them for what had happened. When they start to run low on things, other colonies will help and send things to Boston. Really one of the first times you see them working together and not just looking out for themselves, because they really did see themselves as 13 individual entities, and now they're looking at it as starting to help each other out, starting to identify as a group rather than just 13 individual English colonies. Continental Congress got together to assert the rights of colonists. A lot of meetings, a lot of committees, a lot of groups getting together to reassert colonial rights, and they're going to figure out how can we respond to the Coercive Act, the Quebec Act. The Quebec Act had been passed, allowing the French to go into that Ohio River area that had been restricted to the colonists because of the Proclamation Line. Now the French are getting to go over there, that are now under British control. They took away the requirements that the French had to have a trial by jury. So the colonists are feeling very threatened by that. It was all part of the Quebec Act. So people are feeling, again, very tense. They get together at this Continental Congress. They pass the Suffolk Resolves, and basically declaring the Intolerable Acts null and void, said to resist British tyranny with force if necessary, and again passing another Declaration of American Rights saying these are our rights, please don't violate them, need to adhere to our rights and protect those rights. The Continental Association, or known as the Association, was also created at this point, like another communication organization, requiring the colonies that they want to be part of it to sign an oath, to join the boycott, to join the movement against the British. Trying to help them enforce boycotts. They've had town meetings, and again, the response to all of this is the British say Massachusetts was in rebellion, the local authorities are losing control, they're trying to prohibit their trade with other nations, and trying to figure out a way to come to some sort of a compromise between the English and the colonists. The British send the conciliatory proposition sent out to individual colonists, offering to colonies, not recognize the Continental Congress, but sending out to the colonies themselves, offering to eliminate the revenue gathering taxes. And Virginia rebels met to discuss it, and Patrick Henry had a very emphatic and dramatic response to it, which was give me liberty or give me death. So there's many people who said we're not going to move back from here. There's not going to be a compromise at this point.